30 years on the books, and you can't even fill out a DD 214 worksheet correctly. Master Sergeant? Is that what we're looking at here? The crowd laughed. A small, sycophantic ripple of nervous energy in the sterile confines of the base outprocessing center. Master Sergeant Anya Sharma said nothing, her gaze fixed on the smudged ink of her own signature. But when the dust-caked helicopter carrying the Admiral banked hard over the accident site, and he saw the calm epicenter of the chaos, he knew exactly what he was looking at. If you believe that true respect is a mirror reflecting not what is said, but what is done, type competence below. The voice belonged to Captain Eva Rostova, an officer whose crisp, new uniform seemed to possess more time in service than she did. Rostova held the paperwork pinched between two fingers, as if its minor clerical errors were a communicable disease. Her voice was a finely tuned instrument of institutional condescension, honed in classrooms and theory, yet untested by the grit and friction of genuine crisis. The air in the room was thick with the smell of floor wax and the quiet desperation of finality, a place where careers spanning decades were reduced to a series of checkboxes and signatures. For Anya Sharma, this was the last checkbox, her final hour of a 30-year career. She looked less like a warrior and more like a librarian who had wandered onto a military installation by mistake. Her uniform, though clean and properly worn, was faded at the seams, softened by 1,000 washes in harsh field conditions. The lines on her face were not the sharp, aggressive cuts of a commander, but the intricate, patient etchings of a cartographer who had mapped landscapes of human suffering and endurance. There was a slight stoop to her shoulders, not of weakness, but of having carried heavy things for a very long time. Her hands, resting on the countertop, were the only things that betrayed the quiet narrative of her life. They were scarred and capable, the knuckles slightly swollen, the nails clean but short, the movements economical and sure. They were hands that had set bones in the dark, sutured wounds under fire, and held the hands of the dying in the deafening silence after the battle was over. Captain Rostova, however, saw none of this. She saw only an older woman, a relic, an administrative hurdle in her otherwise perfectly efficient morning. "Master Sergeant," she repeated, her voice louder this time, demanding the attention of everyone in the waiting area. "Your previous duty assignment section is incomplete. It lists your last 10 years as attached to Special Activities Division. That's not a real unit. That's a catch-all for paper pushers and people who've been put out to pasture. I need actual unit designations. Fort Bragg? Camp Lejeune? Someplace real." Another titter of laughter from the junior clerks who orbited Rostova. Sharma's eyes briefly lifted from the form. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky over a frozen plain. They met Rostova's sharp, accusatory gaze for a single, unblinking moment. In that moment, there was no anger, no defiance, no humiliation. There was only a profound, unshakable calm, an emptiness that seemed to absorb the captain's hostility without reflection. Then, she looked back down at the paper. "That is the correct designation, ma'am," she said. Her voice was low and gravelly, a voice accustomed to being used sparingly and only for essential communication. It was the oral equivalent of her physical presence, unassuming, yet possessed of a strange, immovable weight. The word "ma'am" was delivered with perfect military courtesy, yet it landed in the air with a quiet irony that only someone with decades of experience could achieve, the flawless execution of a regulation that simultaneously highlighted the absurdity of the one enforcing it. Rostova's face tightened. She was not accustomed to being met with such placid resistance. She saw it as insubordination, a final, petty act of defiance from an obsolete soldier. "We are not leaving this office until this is corrected, Master Sergeant," Rostova declared, dropping the papers onto the counter with a sharp slap. "Your retirement is on hold until you can remember where you've actually been for the last decade. Perhaps a walk down memory lane will jog the old gray matter." The insult hung in the air, thick and ugly. The clerks shifted uncomfortably. The joke had gone on too long. Sharma simply picked up the form, her movements methodical and unhurried. She found a pen, uncapped it, and stood perfectly still, as if considering the vast, unwritten history Rostova was demanding. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights above. It wasn't the silence of submission. It was the silence of a deep well, a quiet that hinted at depths the captain could not possibly comprehend. It was the calm of a professional who had faced down terrors that would shatter Rostova's procedural world into a million pieces, and she would not be rattled by a captain with a clipboard. The institutional arrogance of Captain Rostova was a specific, well-cultivated vintage. It was the product of a system that often mistook confidence for competence and academic achievement for genuine wisdom. She was a recent academy graduate, top of her class in logistics and management, and she had arrived at this sprawling desert training base with a mandate to streamline operations. To her, this meant enforcing every regulation with the unyielding fervor of a zealot, treating the complex human ecosystem of the military as a flowchart to be optimized. People were assets, procedures were gospel, and experience was an unquantifiable and therefore irrelevant variable. Her fixation on Master Sergeant Sharma's paperwork was not about the form itself. It was an assertion of her newly acquired authority. She was making an example of the quiet, weary-looking woman to demonstrate to the entire administrative section that the old, lax ways were over. Rostova was the new order, an order of crisp lines, digital precision, and unwavering adherence to the text. She saw Sharma's faded uniform and tired eyes as symbols of the decay she was here to eradicate. Master Sergeant, Rostova continued, her voice dripping with artificial patience, I am trying to help you. The system requires specifics. Without them, your retirement pay could be flagged, your benefits delayed. I am simply ensuring that your transition into civilian life is as smooth as your service has apparently been vague. The sarcasm was a bludgeon, crude and obvious. Sharma's gaze remained on the paper. She was not thinking about Rostova. She was not replaying the insult. Her mind was a quiet, orderly place, and in this final hour, it was occupied with the small, tangible details of departure. The weight of her medical bag, which she had already packed in her car, a worn leather satchel whose contents she knew by touch alone. The drive to the small house she had bought near the coast, a place she had only seen in pictures. The promise of a silence that was not pregnant with impending violence, but filled with the simple sounds of wind and water. This confrontation was merely a final, irritating hum from a world she was already leaving behind. She knew the designation Special Activities Division was a carefully constructed wall of bureaucratic black ink. It was designed to repel people exactly like Captain Rostova. It was a name that meant nothing precisely because it meant everything. Behind that simple phrase lay a decade of ghost operations, of missions that never officially happened, in places that did not officially exist. It was a decade spent as the dedicated medical guardian for men who were themselves ghosts, the surgical instruments of national policy. How could she write that on a form? Third man through the door in Kandahar. Sole medic for Task Force Orion during Operation Nightfall. Stabilized 2 operators with catastrophic blast injuries using only a Leatherman and a roll of gaffer tape in a cave in the Hindu Kush. The very idea was absurd. The system was designed for mutual denial. The quiet professionals did their work, and the bureaucracy, in return, pretended they didn't exist. Rostova, in her ignorance, was clawing at the very fabric of that unspoken contract. A distant boom echoed across the base, a familiar sound of artillery practice on the far ranges. It was a sound so common it went unnoticed by most, the daily percussion of a life dedicated to readiness. But then another sound followed, sharp, metallic, and profoundly wrong. A screech of tortured metal, followed by a concussive crump that was not the clean detonation of ordnance, but the chaotic sound of immense weight and energy colliding. Every head in the out-processing center snapped towards the windows. A thick plume of black smoke began to rise against the clear desert sky, maybe a mile away, near the main training thoroughfare. Alarms began to blare across the base, a frantic, rising wail that cut through the mundane afternoon. A young private burst into the office, his face pale with panic. Mass Calavent, training convoy, a fuel tanker, and 2 troop carriers collided. They're saying it's bad. Captain Rostova froze for a split second, her flowchart mind struggling to process this sudden, violent intrusion of reality. Then her training kicked in. "Lock down the office," she commanded, her voice sharp but brittle. "Give me a line to the base commander. I need a status report on all available emergency response assets. Go now." The clerk scrambled, a flurry of panicked activity. In the midst of this sudden chaos, Anya Sharma performed 3 simple, deliberate actions. She placed the pen neatly on the countertop. She folded the controversial DD 214 worksheet in half and slid it into her pocket. And then she turned and walked, not ran, towards the door, her steps as measured and calm as they had been a moment before. Her movement was so contrary to the frantic energy in the room that it created a strange, silent wake. She was a rock parting a panic stream. Rostova, turning from her phone, saw her leaving. "Master Sergeant, where do you think you're going?" she yelled, her voice straining with disbelief. "This facility is on lockdown. You are not dismissed." Anya Sharma did not stop. She did not turn around. She did not answer. She simply opened the door and stepped out into the screaming alarm, walking towards the smoke, towards the chaos, towards the work that had defined her entire life for one last time. Her 30 years of service were over. Her duty was not. The scene at the crash site was a vision from hell, a tangled sculpture of burning steel and human agony set against the indifferent blue sky. A massive fuel tanker lay on its side, flames belching from a ruptured seam, feeding the pillar of greasy black smoke that served as a beacon for the base's emergency services. 2 troop transport trucks were mangled beyond recognition, one crushed against the tanker, the other having flipped and rolled several times, scattering equipment and bodies across the asphalt. The air was a toxic cocktail of diesel fumes, burning rubber, and the metallic tang of blood. The screams of the wounded were a constant, terrible chorus, punctuated by the panicked shouts of the first responders, who were mostly young soldiers from a nearby engineering unit, armed with little more than standard-issue first aid kits and a desperate courage. They were overwhelmed, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the catastrophe. They moved without purpose, their efforts chaotic and often counterproductive, a testament to the chasm between training simulations and the visceral, heart-stopping reality of a mass casualty event. Captain Rostova arrived in a staff car, siren blaring, her mind a whirlwind of logistical priorities. She saw a supply chain problem. She saw a resource allocation failure. She saw a public relations disaster. She began barking orders, her voice a sharp counterpoint to the groans of the injured. "Establish a perimeter. I want a 100-meter cordon. Get the fire trucks to focus on the tanker. Someone give me a manifest. How many personnel were in those vehicles?" Her commands were technically correct, textbook crisis management. But they were the commands of a manager, not a savior. She was managing the scene, not engaging with the suffering at its core. While Rostova was organizing the chaos, Anya Sharma was already inside of it. She had arrived on foot, having run the last half-mile with a steady, ground-eating stride that spoke of decades of conditioning. She carried no official equipment, had no authority, no orders. But she possessed something far more powerful, an absolute clarity of purpose. Her eyes, that pale, wintry blue, scanned the wreckage not with horror, but with a chillingly precise diagnostic gaze. She was not seeing twisted metal and broken bodies. She was seeing airway obstructions, tension pneumothoraxes, catastrophic hemorrhages. She was triaging on the move, her mind automatically sorting the wounded into 3 categories. Those who would die no matter what, those who would live no matter what, and those who would die unless she did something right now. It was this last group she moved towards. She ignored the chaos, the flames, the shouting. Her world shrank to the immediate, solvable problem in front of her. She knelt beside a young soldier whose leg was partially severed, the blood pumping out in rhythmic, life-ending spurts. A terrified corporal was trying to apply a pressure dressing, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it. Sharma placed a calm hand on his shoulder. "I've got it," she said, her voice cutting through his panic like a surgeon's scalpel. He looked up at her, this unassuming older woman who seemed to have appeared from nowhere, and simply nodded, relinquishing the task with a flood of relief. Sharma's hands went to work. From her own pocket, she pulled a simple black tactical tourniquet she had carried every day for 20 years. With swift, practiced motions, she applied it high on the soldier's thigh, twisting the windlass until the bleeding stopped. Then, with a black marker she produced from another pocket, she wrote a T in the time on his forehead. The entire procedure took less than 15 seconds. Without a word, she was on to the next one. Her movements became a kind of brutal, life-saving ballet. She was a force of pure competence in a sea of well-intentioned incompetence. She found a private with a sucking chest wound, the air whistling gruesomely from a hole in his ribs. Ripping open his uniform, she took the plastic wrapper from a field dressing, slapped it over the wound to create a makeshift occlusive seal, and taped it down on 3 sides, creating a flutter valve. It was an old trick, one not found in the newest manuals, but remembered in the muscle memory of a medic who had learned her trade when ingenuity was as important as equipment. She moved from body to body, her actions a blur of efficiency. She used a soldier's belt to splint a broken arm, a discarded rifle sling to fashion a pelvic binder. She saw a young lieutenant going into shock, his face pale and clammy. She laid him flat, elevated his legs with a discarded helmet, and covered him with a fire-retardant blanket from the wreckage, conserving every precious degree of body heat. She did not have a medical bag, so she made the entire crash site her medical bag. Her calm was infectious. The panicked young soldiers who had been running in circles began to gravitate towards her, drawn to her quiet authority. She didn't shout. She didn't command. She gave simple, direct instructions. "You, hold pressure here. Don't let go, you. I need 3 shirts. Rip them into strips. Now, tell me your name, son. Keep talking to me. Stay with me." They obeyed without question. They didn't know who she was. She wore no rank on her collar, no medic patch on her arm, but they recognized in her something elemental, the absolute certainty of someone who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death so many times that she had learned to navigate it by heart. Captain Rostova, meanwhile, was losing control. The fire was spreading. The official medical response was still 10 minutes out. Her logistical perimeter was useless against the tide of human suffering. She saw Sharma working, a strange, quiet figure at the heart of the storm, and her first instinct was anger and confusion. Who was this civilian? This old woman? How dare she interfere? She started to march towards Sharma, ready to assert her authority, to demand this unauthorized person leave the scene. But she stopped. She stopped because she saw the faces of the soldiers who were helping Sharma. She saw the hope in their eyes. She saw the way they looked at this stranger with a reverence they did not show her, their appointed commander. She saw that in the span of 5 minutes, this woman had saved more lives with her bare hands than Rostova could save with all her regulations and radio calls. Rostova watched as Sharma knelt beside a soldier who was clearly gone, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. Sharma gently closed his eyelids, straightened his uniform, and paused for a fraction of a second, a silent, final act of respect. Then she moved on. In that moment, watching that small, profound gesture, Captain Rostova's world of flowcharts and procedures began to crumble, replaced by a terrifying, humbling glimpse of what true leadership, what true service actually looked like. She was witnessing a master at work, and the sight left her speechless, her own authority rendered utterly meaningless. The deafening silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence of awe. It fell over the small section of wreckage where Sharma worked, a bubble of focused intensity that seemed to warp the chaos around it. A heavy thumping sound began to beat against the air, a rhythmic pulse that grew steadily louder, drowning out the crackle of the flames and the distant wail of approaching sirens. A Black Hawk helicopter, sleek and menacing, descended from the sky, its rotor wash kicking up a blinding storm of sand and debris. It didn't land at the designated emergency LZ Rostova had been trying to clear. It settled with unnerving precision just 50 yards from the burning tanker, a bold and dangerous maneuver. The side door slid open before the skids even touched the ground. A man stepped out, his presence immediately commanding the entire scene. He was tall and lean, wearing a flight suit, but he moved with the unmistakable economy of a lifelong operator. He was Rear Admiral Jackson Stonewall Cole, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He was a living legend, a man whose career was a classified history of modern American conflict. His face was a mask of hardened granite, and his eyes, cold and analytical, swept across the disaster with an all-encompassing glance. His gaze passed over the burning trucks, the overwhelmed first responders, and the flustered figure of Captain Rostova, who was now running toward him, desperate to brief the senior officer who had just landed in her jurisdiction. But the Admiral's eyes didn't stop on her. They kept scanning, searching, until they found the quiet woman kneeling beside a wounded soldier. His expression, for the briefest of moments, changed. The hard granite softened into something else, recognition, and something akin to reverence. He ignored Rostova's frantic approach, her shouted, "Admiral, sir." "Captain Rostova, base logistics. I'm the on-scene commander." He walked right past her, as if she were a ghost, his boots crunching on the shattered asphalt, his path unwavering. He was walking toward Anya Sharma. The small crowd of soldiers helping Sharma saw him coming. They saw the stars on his collar and immediately stiffened to attention, their hands, slick with blood, snapping into clumsy salutes. Admiral Cole didn't acknowledge them. His focus was entirely on the woman on the ground. Sharma was in the process of inserting a nasopharyngeal airway into a soldier struggling to breathe, her movements as delicate and precise as a watchmaker's. She seemed completely unaware of the Admiral's approach, her entire being focused on the life in her hands. She finished her task, checked the soldier's pulse, and only then did she seem to notice the tall figure standing over her. She looked up, her pale blue eyes meeting his. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. A silent conversation passed between them, a conversation that spanned a decade of shared secrets and brutal realities. It was the look of two people who had seen the worst of the world together and had survived. "Anya," the Admiral said, his voice a low rumble that was somehow heard over the din. "It's been a long time, sir," she replied, her voice steady. She made no move to stand, her duty still with the man at her feet. It was at this moment that Captain Rostova finally caught up, her face flushed with indignation at being so thoroughly ignored. "Admiral, sir, I must insist you clear the area. And this woman," she pointed a trembling finger at Sharma, "this woman is a civilian. She has no authority here. She's contaminating a catastrophic incident scene. I've ordered her to stop, but she refuses to." The Admiral turned his head slowly, and the full, undivided force of his legendary cold fury fell upon Captain Rostova. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud. It was quiet. It was perfectly calm, and it was the most terrifying sound Rostova had ever heard. "Captain," he said, clipping off the word, "you will be silent, and you will not address this woman again. Is that understood?" Rostova's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She simply nodded, her face ashen. The Admiral turned back to Sharma. "They told me you were retiring today," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "I see you haven't quite clocked out yet. One last patient, sir," Sharma said, her focus already returning to the wounded soldier. The Admiral nodded. "Carry on, Master Sergeant." The title, spoken with such casual, profound respect, hung in the air. Master Sergeant. Rostova's mind reeled. This woman was military? This quiet old woman? It didn't make sense. The Admiral had just brought his entire command staff with him, and one of them, a tech specialist, was already setting up a ruggedized communications terminal. The Admiral looked at him. Pull up service record for Sharma, Anya. Master Sergeant. Security clearance, Yankee Zulu 959er. The tech's fingers flew across the keyboard. After a moment, his eyes widened. He looked at the Admiral, then at the woman on the ground, then back at his screen. Sir, I'm in. But most of it is black. Read me what isn't black, son, the Admiral commanded, his voice carrying to everyone in the now silent crowd. The tech specialist swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the illuminated screen of the tactical datapad. The harsh desert sun made the text difficult to read, but the weight of the words was palpable, settling over the assembled onlookers like a physical shroud. The air, which moments before had been filled with screams and sirens, now held a different kind of tension, the electric hum of a myth being unveiled. The Admiral stood impassively, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Captain Rostova, ensuring she heard every single word. Service record, Sharma, Anya. Master Sergeant. The tech began, his voice hesitant at first, then growing stronger as he read. Enlisted 30 years ago. Basic combat training, Fort Sam Houston. Advanced individual training, medical specialist. Initial assignments, Walter Reed, Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, Airborne School, Ranger School. A murmur went through the small crowd of soldiers. Ranger School. For a medic, it was rare. For a female medic of her generation, it was almost unheard of. The tech continued, his voice gaining a rhythm, a cadence of disbelief. Recipient of the Combat Medical Badge, with 2 stars. Bronze Star Medal, with Valor Device. Army Commendation Medal, with 3 oak leaf clusters. Purple Heart. He paused, scrolling down the screen. Sir, the list of commendations and unit awards is extensive. Skip to the last 10 years. The Admiral ordered, his voice flat and cold as steel. The part Captain Rostova found so vague, Rostova flinched as if struck. Her face had gone from ashen to a deep, mottled red of pure, unadulterated shame. She stared at Sharma, who was now calmly checking the stability of a makeshift splint, seemingly oblivious to the recitation of her own legend. Last 10 years, the tech confirmed. Designation: attached to Special Activities Division Unit of Assignment, United States Army Special Operations Command. Detailed to, Sir, it's just a series of code names. Task Force Nomad. Operation Winter, Sunday Joint Task, Force Apex. The names meant nothing to most of the listeners, but to the Admiral, and to the few quiet professionals who might one day hear this story, they were the chapter headings in the secret history of a long and brutal war. There's more, sir, the tech said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. A citation. For a Navy Cross, the silence was now absolute. A Navy Cross, awarded by the Department of the Navy to a soldier from the Army. Such a thing was exceedingly rare, reserved for acts of heroism so extraordinary that they transcended inter-service rivalries. It was a medal second only to the Medal of Honor. Read it, the Admiral commanded. The tech cleared his throat. For extraordinary heroism while serving as the senior combat medic for a Special Operations Task Force during a direct action mission on date and location redacted, when her element came under heavy enemy fire, resulting in multiple critical casualties, including the team's naval special warfare operator, Master Sergeant Sharma, with complete disregard for her own safety, moved through a sustained and accurate field of enemy fire to render life-saving aid. She successfully stabilized 2 critically wounded operators while simultaneously engaging enemy combatants, defending her position for over an hour until extraction was possible. Her courage under fire, medical skill, and unwavering devotion to her comrades were directly responsible for saving the lives of 3 American operators and were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service. The tech finished reading. He looked up, his face filled with an awe that bordered on fear. He was looking at a ghost, a woman whose true history had been deliberately buried under layers of classification. Captain Rostova stood frozen, the words washing over her, each one a separate indictment of her own colossal ignorance. The old gray matter. She had mocked held memories of things she could not even imagine. The vague service history was a litany of heroism she could never hope to match. The Admiral let the silence hang for a long, punishing moment. Then he walked over to where Sharma was finishing her work. The last of the wounded were now being loaded onto ambulances by the newly arrived medical teams. Sharma finally rose to her feet, wiping her bloody hands on a piece of discarded cloth. She looked tired, her shoulders finally succumbing to the stoop she had been fighting all day. Admiral Cole stood directly in front of her. He looked at her faded uniform, her scarred hands, her weary face. And then, in front of the assembled crowd of soldiers, medics, and one utterly humiliated captain, Rear Admiral Jackson Stonewall Cole, a man who commanded the most elite warriors on the planet, drew himself up to his full height and rendered a slow, perfect formal salute. "Master Sergeant Sharma," he said, his voice thick with an emotion no one had ever heard from him before. "On behalf of a grateful nation, and for services that can never be fully acknowledged, thank you." "You are relieved." Sharma looked at him, her pale blue eyes holding his for a moment. Then, with a flicker of a smile, she returned the salute, her movements as crisp and precise as they had been 30 years ago. "Thank you, sir," she said. It was over. The story of Master Sergeant Sharma's last hour on the job became the stuff of instant legend. It spread not through official channels or after-action reports, but through the barracks grapevine, the most powerful and myth-making communication network in the military. It traveled in whispers over late-night card games, in hushed tones in the Chow Hall line, and in embellished retellings at the smoky off-base bars. Every soldier who had been at the crash site became a storyteller, a primary source for the burgeoning epic. The tale grew with each telling. In one version, she had performed open-heart surgery with a K-bar knife. In another, she had single-handedly held up a burning truck to free a trapped soldier. They said she had stared down the flames from the fuel tanker, and they had retreated. They said Admiral Stonewall Cole, a man rumored to be carved from ice and fury, had wept. The details were fantastical, but the core truth remained, and it was more powerful than any embellishment. A quiet, unassuming woman, on the verge of disappearing into civilian life, had stepped into chaos and imposed order through sheer, undeniable competence. Her name became a byword for a certain kind of excellence. Young medics, when faced with a difficult diagnosis, would ask each other, what would Sharma do? An NCO, seeing a soldier perform a task with quiet, methodical skill, would nod and say, "That's some Sharma-level work right there." The out-processing center, once a place of bureaucratic purgatory, became a kind of historical landmark. Captain Rostova was never officially reprimanded. Admiral Cole understood that the public humiliation she had endured was a far more profound and lasting punishment than any black mark on her record. She became a ghost in her own office, her once booming voice reduced to a quiet murmur, her arrogant stride replaced by a hesitant shuffle. The incident had shattered her rigid worldview, forcing her to confront the vast difference between knowing the rules and understanding the game. She was hollowed out, but it was in that emptiness that a new kind of wisdom began to take root. She saw the faces of the soldiers Sharma had saved every day. They were walking, talking reminders of her failure of perception. The weight of her assumption was a heavier burden than any official punishment. The legend of Anya Sharma also served a deeper, more institutional purpose. It was a powerful, real-world parable about the core theme of military service, that respect is earned, not conferred. It was a visceral reminder that the most dangerous person on the battlefield is not always the one who makes the most noise. In a culture that was increasingly grappling with issues of gender, age, and the changing face of the modern warrior, the story of the grandma who broke hell was a clarifying force. It cut through prejudice and preconception with the clean, simple truth of demonstrated ability. Anya Sharma herself, of course, was gone. She had left the base that same evening, slipping away without ceremony, her small car heading east toward the coast and the quiet life she had earned 1,000 times over. She left behind nothing but a folded, blood-stained DD, .214 form in her pocket, and a legend that would outlive her career by decades. She required no validation beyond the knowledge of a job well done. Her legacy was not in the medals or the citations, but in the living, breathing soldiers who were alive because of her actions, and in the transformed culture of a base that had been forced to remember that true strength is often found in the quietest corners. A week after the incident, Captain Rostova sat in her silent office, staring at the blank screen of her computer. The flowcharts and efficiency reports that had once been her Bible now seemed like meaningless abstract art. She had requested, through unofficial channels, Master Sergeant Sharma's forwarding address. It had taken some doing, but the Admiral's aide, perhaps sensing an opportunity for a final, crucial lesson, had provided it. For 3 days, Rostova drafted and redrafted a letter. She tried to be formal, citing regulations on conduct and professional courtesy. It sounded hollow. She tried to be emotional, expressing her profound regret. It sounded self-serving. Finally, she wrote from a place of raw, unvarnished humility. The letter was short. It acknowledged her arrogance, her ignorance, and her prejudice. It stated, in simple terms, that watching Sharma work had been the most important lesson in leadership she had ever received. It ended with a simple, handwritten sentence. I am sorry, she sent the letter, not expecting a reply. It was an act of penance, not a bid for forgiveness. 2 weeks later, a small, plain envelope appeared in her mail slot. There was no return address. Inside was a single note card. The handwriting was neat, practical, and devoid of flourish. It read, Captain, we all make assumptions. The important thing is what we do after they are proven wrong. Do good work, that was all. There was no signature. Anya Sharma had offered not forgiveness, but a directive, a path forward. For Rostova, that simple note became her new gospel. She taped it to the inside of her desk drawer, a private reminder of the day her career almost ended and her education truly began. The symbolic artifact of the event was not one, but many. The black tactical tourniquet Sharma had used, stained with the blood of the first soldier she saved, was recovered. The young man, now recovering, refused to part with it. It became his personal talisman, a reminder of the anonymous angel who had appeared out of the smoke. At the base medical training center, the instructors began to incorporate the story into their curriculum. The plastic field dressing wrapper she had used as a chest seal was mounted in a small shadow box on the wall of the main classroom. Underneath it, a small brass plaque was engraved with the words, improvise, adapt, overcome. In memory of MSGT, Sharma's last hour, the legend had found its physical form, a permanent teaching tool for generations of new medics. Sharma, meanwhile, found her peace. Her small house by the sea was quiet, as promised. She spent her days walking on the beach, reading books, and learning the names of the coastal birds. Occasionally, a young person from the local town, a new paramedic or a volunteer firefighter, would hear a rumor about the quiet woman who lived by the shore and seek her out. They would ask for advice, for a story, for a lesson. She never spoke of the Navy Cross or the secret missions. Instead, she would show them how to properly pack a wound, how to stay calm when everyone else is screaming, how to listen to a patient's breathing and know, in an instant, what was wrong. She taught them the philosophy of quiet competence, not with war stories, but with simple, practical demonstrations of her craft. She was passing on not her legend, but her legacy, planting the seeds of her experience in a new generation, ensuring that the work, the real work, would continue long after her name was forgotten. A year passed. The sun beat down on the same sprawling desert base, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The change was subtle, an alteration in the cultural frequency that was felt more than seen. It was present in the way a young lieutenant listened patiently to the advice of a seasoned sergeant, in the way a supply clerk took the extra time to ensure a medic's bag was packed exactly to their specification, in the general, unspoken understanding that a uniform and a rank were merely the cover of a book, not the story contained within. The out-processing center was no longer a place of cold, impersonal bureaucracy. It was managed with a quiet efficiency that was tempered with a deep, abiding respect for the years of service represented by each form. Captain Rostova was still there, but she was a different officer entirely. The brittle arrogance was gone, replaced by a calm, observant authority. Her eyes no longer scanned for errors in paperwork, but for the stories behind them. She had learned to see the person first, the file second. She had become one of the most respected junior officers on the base, known for her fairness and her fierce advocacy for the enlisted personnel under her command. Her transformation was perhaps the most tangible part of Anya Sharma's legacy. She had not just saved lives on that day. She had salvaged a career, remolding an arrogant gatekeeper into a true leader. The Sharma Protocol, a set of guidelines for responding to mass casualty events based on the action she had taken, was now the gold standard, not just on this base, but adopted by training commands across the service. It emphasized simplicity, improvisation, and the empowerment of the lowest-ranking individuals on the scene, trusting in the competence of the person over the rigidity of the plan. The story of her last hour had become institutional folklore, a foundational myth told to every new arrival. It served as a warning against assumption and a celebration of the quiet professional. It was a reminder that heroes were not always the ones on the recruiting posters. Sometimes they were the quiet, unassuming figures in the background, the ones who simply did the work day in and day out, without fanfare or expectation of reward. The legend was no longer about the impossible feats. It was about the principle. It was about the triumph of demonstrated skill over loud assertion. It was about the moral authority that comes only from a lifetime of dedicated, selfless service. Anya Sharma had left the military, but in a strange and powerful way, her presence was more deeply felt now than it had ever been when she was in uniform. She had become an idea, a standard to which others could aspire. Her silence had left a far more profound echo than any shouted command ever could. The institution, in its slow, grinding way, had learned her lesson. It had been reminded that its greatest strength was not in its technology or its strategy, but in the quiet, indomitable spirit of its people, people like the master sergeant who, in her final hour, taught them all the true meaning of duty. The ripple effects of that single hour continued to spread, a quiet and persistent wave of change that washed over the entire community, cleansing it of its worst assumptions and leaving behind a renewed sense of purpose and mutual respect. True legacy is not a monument of stone that we leave behind for others to look at. It is not a name carved on a wall or a list of medals locked away in a display case. That is history, a static record of things that are over. A true legacy is a living thing. It is the continuation of a standard, the propagation of an idea, the quiet transfer of wisdom from one soul to another. It is the surgeon whose hands are guided by the memory of a mentor's instruction. It is the firefighter who walks into a burning building with a calm, learned from a veteran captain. It is the young officer who chooses to listen instead of command because she once witnessed the catastrophic cost of arrogance. Anya Sharma's legacy was not in the file that Admiral Cole had revealed. It was in the change he had forced upon Captain Rostova. It was in the young medics who now carried themselves with a quiet confidence, knowing their worth was in their hands, not on their sleeves. It was in the culture of a place that had been reminded that the most vital work is often done far from the spotlight, by professionals who have nothing to prove to anyone but themselves. The quiet professionals are the foundation upon which everything else is built. They're the load-bearing walls of any great enterprise, the unseen supports that allow the magnificent facade to stand. They seek no credit, for the successful completion of the mission is their only required validation. They avoid the spotlight, for they know that ego is a liability, a distraction from the relentless focus required to perform at the highest levels. Their silence is not emptiness. It is a discipline. It is the stillness of a deep lake, which reflects the world with perfect clarity precisely because its own waters are undisturbed. It is the silence of the master craftsman at the bench, the sniper on the ridge, the medic in the chaos, a state of such profound concentration that the noisy, chattering world of ego and self-promotion simply fades away. We live in a world that too often celebrates the loud, the brash, the self-proclaimed. We are drawn to the spectacle, to the confident pronouncements of those who are certain of their own brilliance. But the story of Anya Sharma, and of the countless quiet professionals like her, reminds us of a more enduring truth. That competence is its own language, spoken through action. That respect is a debt paid to demonstrated worth. And that a life of quiet, dedicated service can create a legacy that echoes long after the last word is spoken. The greatest strength is not the power to command attention, but the discipline to command oneself. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.